Hey everybody, I wanted to make a video on Summoner since this class is coming out in the West pretty soon on December 14th, which is just over a week away at the time of me posting this video. I noticed that there's just not a lot of English resources talking about this class, and one of the reasons why is she's just not that popular in the other regions like Russia, Korea, and Japan. Up until recently, she was riddled with bugs and poor quality of life. She had questionable damage, and she really only had one build path, which was extremely expensive for all those problems that we just mentioned. And so after a series of buffs, she's an outstandingly good hitmaster class we pick up today as either an alt or a main with a lot of different build paths which allow you to either go really budget or to go all out. So this is going to be about a 20-minute video, an overview talking about the individual builds and engravings, as well as what this class excels at and where it's weak, and some of the nuances that you should be aware of before you decide to invest your time, effort, and resources into building her. Starting with a general overview, this class is for people who want a powerful long-range caster that either uses summons, say you played a summoner in another MMORPG, or you want something that's somewhat similar or familiar to the Sorceress playstyle that has arguably better utility across the board while not really sacrificing that much damage. And it's not that committal like an Igniter Sorceress, for example. She has a lot of attacking options, so it's also a really good fit with a player who wants the ability to explore different skill options depending on the situation that they're placed in. It can be very engaging, picking and choosing your identity skill usage depending on the scenario that you're in. So, pros at a glance, she has great damage, she has high stagger, and she has insane weak point that rivals and in some cases even excels beyond the likes of a gun lancer. The cons is she has very low mobility, none of her skills have built-in mobility, relatively low tankiness, as her defense and HP coefficient are a little bit below average, and she doesn't have any innate super armor outside of her identity skills, and she has a ton of animation locks and cast times. Outside of that, it's really important that you also learn animation cast canceling. If you're a sorceress, you're already familiar with this tech, which is canceling the end lag of one casting skill by queuing up another skill. This doesn't take that long to master, and you'll develop the muscle memory for it pretty quick, so don't worry too much about it, but you do need to learn how to do it. And you also need to know that it does not work with smart casting, which is a feature that's not yet in the West at the time of me posting this, but will eventually be in. As far as the general performance of the two primary specs go, with average performance, the Swiftness build that uses pets will almost definitively outperform the Specialization build. With above average player play, they're about similar in terms of damage output, and at absolute mastery of the class and the raid contents, the Specialization build can and usually will outdamage the Swiftness build. First, we're going to talk about the Swiftness Summoner. This is the build that I used to play, but because of the stage of gearing that my Summoner is at now, I actually switched over to the Specialization build for budgeting reasons, and we'll delve into that a little bit later. The Swiftness Summoner excels at damage over time. She's gonna be better in drawn out fights and less effective when you're going into those lower level contents that you've outgeared, which favor bursty builds going from phase to phase to phase or mechanic to mechanic to mechanic. She is particularly good versus bosses that have really tricky patterns that ask the player usually to spend a lot of time dodging, and for the reason for this is because she has ridiculously good damage uptime. About 60% of her damage will actually come from summons, and these summons, all they think to do is zerg the boss. They have really high HP, so they're hard to kill. They have complete immunity to paralysis and push, so they can't be knocked down or anything like that. They can be CC'd, but that's usually not too big of an issue. And because these summons are just constantly attacking the boss, this makes her one of the best progression-based classes in the entire game. That being said, there's still a lot of backline management responsibilities of the summoner herself, because not only is she responsible for still casting skills like Ancient Spear and her identity skills, but on top of that, these summons have a special ability that you unlock when you tripod them in a certain way, and these special abilities deal a huge amount of damage, and they have to be commanded by the summoner. The summons won't just cast them on their own, so you are balancing using your own skills with managing the abilities of your pets. Now, Swiftness Focus means that you have a high natural movement speed and lower cooldowns on your spacebar, which generally leads to safer gameplay. This build also uses both class engravings, with one of them at level 3, so it can be a bit expensive since it's usually going to need 2 class accessories at the mid to mid-late game stage gearing. It usually uses the hallucination set to make up for her lower natural crit. As far as the damage gems go, it uses 7 of them, so it's kind of like an Igniter Sorceress or a Peacemaker Gunslinger in that it's very heavy in the amount of damage gems. But just like those class, this isn't an issue in terms of cost until we're talking about the extreme late game gearing. I'm talking about min-maxing this class by the time you're reaching things like K-Angle and a con way later down the line, most likely in mid to late 2023. So you do need to know that. The cost can get pretty insane depending on if you decide to go this route or, let's say, the specialization route, which is technically much cheaper at that stage of gearing because of the damage being compacted in way less gems. But that being said, as an ult, she has also one of the strongest budget builds available if you can't afford high-level gems and tripods by making use of the Charming set. She's one of the few classes that can make really good use of the Charming set because your pets will activate those bolts of fire and lightning, and they will be a huge contribution of your damage output, even if you yourself cannot hit the boss for that much. So now we're going to talk about the Specialization Summoner. This is the build that I play nowadays. It excels mainly at microbursts. So it gathers up identity really quickly and just as quickly dumps it on these really powerful identity skills. And this is really mainly due to the specialization stat that it's so strong, because the specialization stat scales really well with it. So even though both builds use these identity skills, the Specialization Summoner, it's going to be a lot stronger on her. And because she doesn't really use that much pets, the damage contribution of the skills coming from the summoner make up nearly 100% of the pie, so you have to be casting, and a lot less of your damage is going to be automated. In fact, it's a really, really tiny portion. The specialization build also has 2 focuses, with either crit as the secondary or swiftness as the secondary stat. And this is really mainly a preference thing, and it depends on if you want to use the salvation or hallucination set to offset the lack of crit using the hallucination set, or if you want to focus more on raw pure damage using the salvation set and using crit as your secondary. Personally, if you try this build, I would really recommend the swiftness secondary with the hallucination, since having that 10% attack speed right away is going to be nice. The cooldown reduction is going to be nice as well, so all in all, it'll feel a little bit better to play, because, you know, with this low swiftness, it's gonna feel really clunky, and you have to have a really strong understanding of the boss mechanics to know where exactly you can stand to do these long, drawn-out animations and casts. So, as I mentioned before, the Specialization Summoner, she uses 3 damage gems for her Identity skill, the Ancient Spear skill, and Earth Shatter, and all the other gems are cooldown, and it's mainly for either building meter or her buff and synergy uptime. Speaking of which, we should just quickly cover the personal buff importance. So there are certain classes in the game that buff themselves before they do their attacks, like Soulfist, for example, and Summoner is just like that. She has 2 skills that trigger a very, very strong, it's almost a 60% self-damage buff for several seconds. It's like 6 seconds or something like that. Her damage is only good when casting your powerful skills during these windows, and so you have to kind of buffer your rotations with these skills either in advance or at the very start of your rotation. And so there's going to be a habitual cycling of these 2 skills to make sure that you always have that 50% damage buff before you commit to any sort of burst or all in with your cooldowns. About her identity, it's the Ancient Spirit. It's these 5 runes in the bottom middle of her screen, and it basically turns her into a Swiss Army knife. She has a tool for literally every situation. On the far left is Osh, and it's used for rapid weak point damage. It doesn't really do that much damage or stagger, but it's 2 points of weak point, and it has a really low cost, so you can basically spam it. Alamarge, the next one over, is used for stagger. It also has a 2 weak point, but obviously it has a higher cost. And it actually does really good damage. Against mobile bosses, I actually prefer to use it over Akir. And it does bonus damage if the target is staggered, which makes it actually very comparable to Akir in terms of output, considering its cost. One over to the right from that is the Phoenix, which isn't really used in raiding that much. It's mainly used in Chaos Dungeon and PvP because it's such a wide, powerful skill, but the cost is kind of on the higher side. Sometimes I use it in raiding if I know that I don't really have time to cast Akir and I just want to dump my meter now, and then the boss isn't staggered, so maybe it's a little bit stronger than Alamarge. So in some cases, I'll use it in raiding, but it's pretty rare. The next skill after that is one that's really seldom used. It gives you a shield, which is kind of cool, just you, not your teammates. And it does pretty good damage, but not that good damage. And it does really good stagger as well, but it's a bit long on the animation. So it's really, really niche when you would ever use this. There's actually not many situations where you use it. And so it's the least used of the 5. The last skill, Akir, is probably the most iconic identity skill from Summoner, and this skill does the most damage, but it has a fairly long animation, so you need to have the boss not really moving that much. And one of the cool things about the skill though is because there is a little window before the first ticks of damage occur, you can actually cast it and cast one of your self buffs before all the damage starts rolling in, so you don't actually have to cast your self buff before Akir, you can cast it immediately after Akir. So those are the 5 skills. And again, you have a tool for basically every scenario. Some of these skills can be used to animation cancel out of your casting skills. And so it's really important that you know each of the individual traits of these skills and how they interact with your normal skills, as well as the fight itself. One thing that's really important for me to mention though is that the identity UI is really, really archaic. It's not very good and it's very clunky. But you have 2 identity buttons. One is for cycling the identity bar to the right, and the other one is for actually using the identity skill. The problem is there's nothing to scroll the identity to the left. So let's say you're on Alamarge and you want to go to Osh, which is 1 to the left. You would have to actually hit your identity skill 4 times, cycle past Akir, and then it'll end up back at Osh. This takes some getting used to, but after a while, it's not too bad. You learn to just know how many times you need to click to get to where you need to. I also want to take a moment to talk about Ancient Spear. It's one of her normal skills, and if anything, it is her most iconic normal skill, just like Akir is her most iconic identity skill. Ancient Spear, it looks like the spears that Azena uses when you call her as a Sidereal in a Legion raid. This is a really long cast animation. With the tripods that you normally take on it, it launches these 3 giant spears in a line. And it can be weird to actually learn the targeting for this. And in a way, it can feel like Strike Wave from Berserker, but I'd actually say that the aiming on it is fairly lenient since each individual spear has a giant AoE. The reason I have to talk about the skill is, 1, it's an integral part of your rotation in terms of what animation cancels out of and into as a casting skills, but also because it is one of your biggest contribution damage skills. It does a huge amount of damage, but it also has a lot of traits that are really worth mentioning. The first is, in terms of stagger, it is one of the highest stagger skills in the game. It is insane how much stagger this skill does. The second thing that I have to mention is each individual spear with the tripod setup that you normally use with it deals 1 point of weak point. And the reason why I have to mention this is because that means with 3 spears, it's going to do 1, 1, and 1 weak point damage. Why is this important? The reason is because, first of all, 3 individual points of 1 weak point damage is actually higher than a single instance of level 3 weak point, because weak point has a hidden trait where it's actually logarithmic, meaning level 3 weak point is not the same as 3 level 1s. It's actually a bit worse. And so not only is 3 level 1s going to be better than a single level 3, but because it's 3 instances of weak point, each one is affected by the corrosive bomb. So a corrosive bomb will turn Ancient Spear into a 2, 2, and a 2. So this skill is ridiculously good for weak point, and if you do play the Swiftness build, it has a pretty damn low cooldown at around just 10 seconds, which is crazy. So that's Ancient Spear. It's a fantastic skill and one that you're going to be using a whole lot. We should talk about the defense of the class next. So in her normal skill setup, she doesn't have any tenacity. She doesn't have any level 2 super armors that protect her against push or knockdown. A lot of her skills have paralysis super armor, which is great for avoiding flinching, but if you're in trouble, say against Vulcan or Belshazzar, where they're going to try and knock you off the map, she doesn't have a lot of great options to actually avoid that. However, if you consider her identity skills, then she has an insane amount of tenacity. All of her identity skills, from Osh to Akir, have built-in tenacity super armor, which means if you time these skills correctly, you can completely ignore knockdowns, knock-ups, and flinching with proper timing of casting these skills. So in a way, she actually has a ton, and this is especially more so the case if you're a specialization build. Her natural tankiness, though, is kind of similar to Sorceress. She's not completely paper, but she's not very tanky either, so I'd be careful about using these push immunities on particularly dangerous patterns. Her spacebar, I should mention her spacebar. She has actually an insane spacebar. It's kind of like Sorceress's spacebar, but the distance is slightly further, and it's nearly instantaneous. It's like a real blink in a way. She has definitely one of the best spacebars in the entire game, and it's great because with all these animation locks and long cast times, it allows you to do a lot of last-second repositioning. Talking about her counter, the one that you're going to typically use, it's alright. It's the water spirit skill, but it's not the water that comes out of its mouth. It's actually a cone of water that you throw before the water spirit comes out. And that cone of water, it has kind of a slow activation time, but it has a reasonable range and hit width. It's pretty similar to Sorceress's Cone of Ice, with a slightly faster animation and slightly lower range and width. Summoner synergy is 12% defense down, so the game has so many crit synergies nowadays that it's nice to have the occasional synergy that's not a crit synergy, and it's pretty easy to maintain, but with the caveat that it's linked to one of your self-buff skills. And so what that means is you can't hold on to that self-buff skill, which is Sticky Moss Swamp, because you need to reapply your synergy for your teammates, but you also cannot use it without other cooldowns, because if you do that, you're wasting one of your self-buffs for your rotation. So you basically need to cast it off of cooldown and find a window to immediately cast skills like Ancient Spear and get on with your rotation. You can't waste the buff, but you can't hold it either. So let's talk a little bit about other contents a little bit that aren't just raiding. Chaos Dungeon, easily one of the smoothest clears. She has a lot of gigantic AoE, and with the Betrayal set, which everyone uses, it works really well with her identity because it means she can really spam Phoenixes if you get that Transcendence buff, which is really cool. So she has definitely one of the smoothest Chaos Dungeons in the entire game. I wouldn't recommend using summons for that. I would make a Senior Summoner build just for Specialization Chaos Dungeon, just for that lax playstyle. In PvP, she's definitely one of the most annoying enemies to play against. I don't really know anyone who enjoys playing against her. She's a long-range harasser that also has summons that will peel for her, as well as harass enemies with these really dangerous skills that can stun or deal really high damage and knock down. Not to mention, she has a lot of close-range defensive options like Released Will, which is a super armor that also knocks down, and also Osh, the identity skill, which you can use to protect yourself, or just identity skills in general, like Alamarge. Really any of them that have push immunity that can be used to trade and win trades. So she's really powerful in PvP, not only arena, but also at large scale, like the upcoming Rowan content, where she can just completely decimate enemies from a long range with the Phoenix, which is really hard to dodge and does insane damage and burn damage afterwards. In Hell modes, I'd say that this class is also really good. As mentioned, she has great damage and a lot of insane utility. So for people who have that mastery over the fights, they can really take advantage of the full suite of skills that she has available to her. Lastly, I kind of want to talk about the engravings a little bit, both her class engravings and some of the core engravings. At the end of the day, she's a damage dealer, so she's going to be using Grudge, Keen Blunt weapons, since her crit chance can usually go pretty high in both builds, especially if you're using the hallucination set. Adrenaline, sometimes you'll use it at level 3, sometimes you'll use it at level 1, it depends on which class engraving you're taking. Curse Stall is always an option. And then for the particular engravings for each build, the Swiftness with Pet build uses Raid Captain, since it's Swiftness oriented. So it's going to easily be able to maintain that 140% movement speed to make the most out of Raid Captain. And for the Specialization build, you can use Hitmaster, as almost all of your damage is non-positional, so it's going to be able to fully take advantage of Hitmaster, even the Awakening. You might be wondering, oh, this class has so much casting and animation locks, shouldn't you use all-out attack? The problem is too much damage comes from non-channel skills, and the channel skills that you're using are usually small attacks, which are generally used for things like building meter and whatnot, so you can't really use all-out attack. It's too wasteful. Hitmaster, as I mentioned, you use it with the specialization build, but you typically don't use it with the Swiftness build since it doesn't affect Calcion, the Awakening skill. And Calcion is really powerful while he's out, so it would be wasteful to use Hitmaster over something like Cursed Doll, for example, which affects all of your damage. Adrenaline is pretty easy to maintain overall. In the specialization build, you do a lot of small casting, so generally speaking, it's not going to be much of a problem. And in the Swiftness build, it's even easier because remember those command skills I told you about with the pets? Well, those command skills, they also count towards building adrenaline stacks. The command skills, I actually forgot to mention it while I was talking about Swiftness Summoner, they can be used while you're doing anything else. So you can be in the middle of casting Ancient Spear and you can use the command skills. It doesn't actually have an animation associated with it. You just have to remember to press the button. It doesn't interrupt anything that you're doing. So that's like kind of the balancing and the juggling of the skills when we're talking about that. But going back to the engravings, I do want to mention as well the class engravings and what they actually do, since I think I missed that. Overflowing Sympathy is the summon engraving. It's used with the Swiftness pet build, and it greatly increases their duration as well as their damage output. And the duration means that there's less time where they are on cooldown, so more uptime and more damage. It's a no-brainer. It also affects Calcion itself, the Awakening, so it's a must take, and you raise it to level 3 in the Swiftness build. Senior Summoner is the other class engraving, and it's actually used in both builds, because this identity reduces the cost of using any of the identity skills by 1 bubble, and it enhances the identity skills into better Awakening skills. So without this class engraving, all the identity skills of Ancient Spirit are actually a lot more mediocre. So even the pet build has to take this engraving at least level 1 for that reduced cost and the enhanced skills. But the specialization build will max it out because it also improves the damage of the Ancient Spirit skills as well as gives you crit chance. It just gives you passive crit chance with it, which is pretty important as well. So if you're a Swiftness based build, your extra level 1 engraving with either a 9/7 stone or later on with ancient accessories, where you can make a 3x5 plus 1 build without a 9/7 stone, it's gonna be the Senior Summoner engraving, and that's why it's double class engraving. Overflowing Sympathy at level 3, Senior Summoner at level 1. If you're playing a specialization build, on the other hand, usually your extra level 1 engraving is going to be Adrenaline, especially since you can get crit from other sources like Hallucination, your class engraving, Shreddy, so on and so forth, so it's okay to run it at level 1. Other notes, actually there's not really many other notes, but you can see from this video actually that she has easily one of the most gorgeous weapon glows in the entire game. It's shaped like a flower. I actually like this one even more than the Sorceress one, just because of how much it stands out above the Summoner. That pretty much closes out this video. I don't think there's much else for me to talk about regarding this class. I think I covered everything. She is a fantastic pick. Really, really, really good class that just has so much to offer. And regardless of your budget, you can play this class. Specialization is cheap. Swiftness is a little bit more expensive, but it's fine up until a certain point. Then it gets kind of expensive. And then if you just want to dabble in the class, both the specialization as well as the Swiftness Charming build are super cheap to get started up with and just perform really, really well. So I cannot recommend this class enough. Her damage is good, her stagger is good, her weak point is good. I mean, what's there not to like? So yeah, I hope you guys are looking forward to the Summoner class coming out. I'm looking forward to seeing some of you guys try her out. She's super fun, and I don't think you'll be disappointed with picking her up. Okay, that's all there is to this video, and I will see you guys during the streams and on the next one.